in Washington, D.C.
Tonight, the global stage. President Trump departing shortly for this year's NATO summit, where he'll press allies on defense spending and test his leverage abroad, with Ukraine appealing for more support and tensions with Iran looming over the alliance. We'll discuss the stakes with former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. Plus, Platner under fire. Maine Senate candidate Graham Platner denying a sexual assault allegation from a woman he previously dated after a new report detailed her account. The Democrat canceling events and pushing back in a social media video, but stopping short of ending his campaign, saying he and his team are taking time to reflect on the best path forward. And state of play. President Trump confirming he called FIFA's president to review Vladimir Putin's red card suspension before FIFA cleared the U.S. team striker to play tonight against Belgium.
If it happened to another player, it would have been unfair. But when they take your best player, or just about, they have some great players, and they say you can't play, that's very unfair.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And Joe, we begin tonight with the president just hours from departing the White House en route to Turkey for tomorrow's NATO summit, where defense spending, the conflict with Iran, and Russia's escalating war in Ukraine will be front and center, as Trump previewed in the Oval Office earlier.
President Putin wants it to end. I will tell you that very strongly. What a good call. And President Zelensky actually wants it to end now. And we're going to be going to NATO, and we're going to be talking about it. And I think we're going to get it. I think we're going to get it ended. It's been a terrible situation.
For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson here in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Wendy, we know President Trump will be meeting face-to-face with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky at NATO. Other than that bilateral meeting, do we expect he'll walk away from the summit with anything tangible in hand?
No, is the short answer, Kaylee. There are some plans. I mean, there aren't large plans for deliverables. However, they are going to discuss NATO defense spending. And there's a story on the terminal today that says that Germany, in its new budget, is really trying to increase its defense spending to the level that Trump has wanted it to be, which is 5% of GDP. And so the countries are already trying to make this path forward and to get in his good graces, at least on the defense spending. But he is still very irritated with most of Europe for not helping with the war in Iran, for which they got no heads up or no consultation, and then a request to use their bases. And he's also, they're also wary a little bit of his meeting with Erdogan. I know that Israel today asked Trump to speak sharply to Erdogan about his anti-Israel rhetoric. So these things might happen, but it's not a lot that he'll come back with a goodie bag for the U.S.
Did he speak forcefully with Gianni Infantino? Because he did confirm today that he made the phone call to the head of FIFA to have something? Apparently this red card reviewed, at least. It, of course, has been reversed. This is Valerian Balogun, the U.S. men's soccer team's leading scorer, who will now be playing tonight. Right. And, of course, there are many in the league and around the world outraged by this, Wendy. As an American, are you feeling pretty good about this? The president said there'd be a stain on the game if he was not allowed to play.
Well, the trouble is, Joe, there's actually a stain on the game now. Because even if we, the U.S., win tonight, there will be an asterisk. It will be that, we didn't naturally play by the rules. There has been some talk that perhaps what the team should do is bench Balogun, which they're not going to do, to say that we play by the rules even if the president doesn't. Right. No sports team is going to do that. Yeah. But that's the problem, is that, we've been so enjoying the last few weeks of all the videos of the Europeans coming here and people from all over the world enjoying Buc-ee's and Twinkies and all the horrible things in America that they've been laughing at, but then they tried them and thought, hey, this is great stuff. And America was getting a lot of good vibes from this, and now we have a president who put his thumb on the scale for a game. Even if Infantino says they decided independently, we know they have such a good relationship. Remember that Infantino gave him a fake Nobel Peace Prize. And so, this man seems to want to do anything to please Trump, and putting Balogun back in the game seems to be it.
Well, the Royal Belgian Football Association did appeal this. FIFA said,
and lost.
You should know that there was an official attempt there. Wendy, thank you. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with us here in Washington. For more, we bring in the former Secretary of Defense and former CIA Chief Leon Panetta, now chairman and co-founder of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. With the president getting on Air Force One this evening and heading to the NATO summit, there are a lot of questions about what exactly is on his agenda. And it seems the answer from many of our allies is to make as little news as possible. What are we going to be in for these next couple of days? A cooperative conversation or one that demonizes our allies for not meeting spending requirements?
Well, I hope that's not the case. And obviously, there are a lot that basically think the name of the game is do no harm. And hopefully everybody winds up with good photo ops and gets along. And the meeting is a quiet success. I wish there were more. I would love to see the United States and NATO come together and unify behind the security that NATO is supposed to provide. Europe has increased its defense spending. I think it's important for the United States and Europe's war industries to be able to produce the weapons now that Europe needs in order to really improve its security. Secondly, I hope the United States doesn't talk about withdrawing of forces. That really would be bad. We ought to be talking about, frankly, increasing forces, particularly along the Rhine River and Poland, as well as the Baltic states. And lastly, I wish all of them would stand up to Putin right now at this very important moment in Ukraine, where I think there's a real opportunity to hopefully bring this war to an end.
Well, and we'd love, Mr. Secretary, to talk with you more about that war. But before we do so, on this defense spending target of 5% for other NATO allies, 5% of GDP, would it be reasonable for the United States to be expected to reach that level, understanding that 5% of our GDP is significantly larger than those of European nations? Are we making an ask of these countries that we ourselves would not be willing or able to deliver on?
Well, as a former Secretary of Defense, I think it's more important to think about how you spend money rather than just throwing money at the wall and hoping that some of it sticks to the wall. I think the United States right now is talking about an additional almost $1.5 trillion increase in its defense budget.
Right.
I think there are a lot of questions that need to be asked about just exactly where that kind of money would be spent to make sure that it's spent wisely. So this is not really about the United States' role. I think it's really about whether Europe wants to come together to be able to meet the targets that it should be meeting. And I think it's important for Europe to show strong unity in providing that security. That's the best message that NATO needs to send to Putin and to Russia.
It's been fascinating to watch the progress that Ukraine has been very carefully gathering in its war with Russia. But we've seen on full display, Mr. Secretary, the need for Patriot missiles as Russia overnight struck Kyiv once again. 21 civilians dead in the capital city so far. This aside, though, Ukraine has been on the march. And I'm wondering what could come from this NATO summit that could help Ukraine seize the moment. President Trump is going to be meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. What can be done now to try to hasten the end of this war?
I think that this is a very critical moment in terms of this war. Ukraine has fought bravely and courageously. There has been some unity between the United States and NATO in providing support to Ukraine that I think has been important to this effort. But very importantly, Ukraine has stepped up. They've stepped up with their drone production and the use of drones. Mm-hmm. They've struck back at Russia, really weakened Putin militarily, weakened Russia economically. There's now tremendous fuel shortages in Russia. So they've really had a critical impact right now. This is a moment in time in which the United States and NATO need to provide the missiles that are required in order to give Ukraine the capability to continue to strike Russia if Russia refuses to negotiate. But the only thing that Putin understands is force. We know that. And so it is important for NATO to step up and make clear that Zelensky will get the weapons he needs in order to keep the pressure on Russia. That's the best way to ultimately get Putin to the negotiating table.
But on that, Mr. Secretary, is it possible, if there were to be adequate support from NATO and the U.S. that you are describing for Ukraine, to win this conflict outright by force, or is a negotiated outcome still going to be necessary?
I think right now, considering Ukraine's position and what they've been able to do and continue to do, that it is putting tremendous pressure on Putin right now. And I think if the United States and NATO were to step up and say, we're going to continue to provide strong support to Ukraine, and we are committed to ensuring that Putin does not succeed in the Ukraine. If the United States and NATO can step up and send that kind of message to Putin, I think there's a chance that Putin may very well decide that it's time to negotiate rather than continuing to hurt himself, Russia, and its economy. I don't know that Putin can take a lot more of this kind of weakening that's going on right now. So he's got to make a fundamental decision. Does he continue to try to survive in office? Does he try to negotiate and resolve this issue? Or does he continue to do what he's doing now? Those are the choices, and it's up to the United States and NATO to try to put pressure on Putin to make the right choice.
Facing some stark choices when it comes to Iran as well, Secretary. And lastly, I'd like to ask you about tensions between the U.S. and Israel as the president heads for Turkey, of course. The relationship that he has with Erdogan versus the relationship he has with Netanyahu playing out on the world stage. The president says he wants to send more GE engines to Turkey, possibly a prelude to F-35s being sold to the nation. And of course, we know that that's something that Benjamin Netanyahu does not want to see. We spoke earlier today about all of this with Ivo Daalder, the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to NATO in the Obama administration. Here's what he said.
He's going because President Erdogan, his good friend, asked him to. This is the same president who, of course, is putting his opposition in jail and putting them on trial for trumped-up reasons. I mean, clearly, the president doesn't really understand how NATO works. This isn't about whether the European countries should be helping the United States when it comes to Iran and war in which they were neither consulted nor were asked to participate until after the fact and after it took place.
Secretary, should Turkey receive F-35 fighter jets? And if it did, what would it mean for our relationship with Israel?
Well, that's been in discussion for a long time, going back to my days as Secretary of Defense. I think Turkey is an important ally. And the reality is we have a very important base that is in Turkey. And it's very important to our deployments to the Middle East and elsewhere. So it makes sense to do what we can to try to work with Turkey in helping to provide for their defense. As to specific weapon systems and specific fighter planes, I think that's something to be negotiated out, not only with Erdogan, but with our representatives in the United States Congress. This, again, is another important moment, though, because the situation in Iran remains very unpredictable. And having Turkey as an ally would be very important to sending signals to the Middle East that they cannot continue to have these violations of the ceasefire. They cannot continue to have disruptions that will impact on the Straits of Hormuz, that'll impact on all of us. They cannot continue to just have a situation where Iran has tremendous leverage on the rest of the world. And you cannot have a situation where the United States is facing 60 days of negotiating, particularly on the nuclear issue, and that hasn't even begun to take place. So there's a lot of volatility to the situation in the Middle East. And the United States having a strong relationship with Turkey, as well as NATO, I think is very important to our ability to have more sway in what happens in the Middle East.
All right, Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your insight as always. The former Secretary of Defense and CIA Director Leon Panetta, thank you. And today, history was made after President Trump became the first to ring the opening bell directly from the Oval Office. Trump rung the specially crafted gold bell for a joint New York Stock Exchange NASDAQ opening to celebrate the launch of the Trump Accounts initiative that allows for tax advantage investments for U.S. children with $1,000 in federal seed money for those born during his second term.
Between individual contributions and the seed funds, $800 million in new capital will be invested in the stock market for America's children this week. And I also think that we're going to be putting numbers in the budget, which will be really spectacular, because it's really not costing us anything.
Trump praised individuals like Michael and Susan Dell and companies like Micron for their pledged financial backing of the Trump accounts. And while their bipartisan support for the accounts is there, their launch comes as voters give Trump his lowest rating on the economy since he first took office.
We turn now for a look at how those markets performed with power moves and Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine.
Yeah, the broader markets did well, but two individual stocks seem to actually benefit from all of the attention right now around those Trump accounts. That is Robinhood and BNY. BNY, of course, the oldest bank in the United States. It actually traces its lineage all the way back to Alexander Hamilton. It's going to manage the initial Trump accounts and kind of help develop out this whole project. And then BNY has partnered, of course, with Robinhood, a relatively new company, at least compared to BNY. And Robinhood actually serves as the primary brokerage and the initial trustee for those accounts. Robinhood shares was actually rallying, I believe it was for a third straight day. They were up about 4% in the cash session earlier today. And BNY shares on a 5-day run. A lot of attention right now around both of those stocks. The idea that the influx of money that comes in, of course, that helps to generate fees, certainly for BNY. But of course, for Robinhood, this actually goes far beyond that. The idea that a lot of those folks who come into these accounts, when those kids, of course, start to become older and they start to check their accounts and eventually become adults and maybe even start to make their own investments, the idea is that, well, their first exposure to investing is largely going to be through Robinhood and through that platform there. And a lot of investors see a potential long-term benefit. Those are two of the big beneficiaries in the broader market today. Of course, the broader market did rally primarily on the back of what else? A lot of those big chip names, Joe and Kaylee. And that continues to be the story. And that will continue to be the story as we get deeper into the week. I do just want to bring one other stock to your attention. And this is largely some news crossing the wire late in the session here. And that involves Walmart and apparently some pressure by the Trump administration to try to lower some of the prices out there. Walmart is confirming that it has agreed to lower the price on several key items. This is primarily on ground beef, Pepsi and Coca-Cola products, as well as paper plates and ice cream. Various percentage drops across the board, but basically amounting to about 10 to 20%, depending on the item there. You can see there Walmart earlier in the day was down about 1%. In the after-hours session, basically unchanged.
Yeah, the president managed to scoop Walmart on Truth Social, Romaine.
Always
great to have you. Romaine Bostick live in New York. Coming up on Balance of Power, a battleground race for Senate gets a major jolt this holiday weekend. Who's in, who's out, and what it means for the fight for the control of Congress. Up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
any accusation of non-consensual behavior is categorically false, regardless of the inaccuracy of the reporting, but mindful of the political reality it will inflict. We are taking the time to reflect on the best path forward for the state that I love, the people that I love, the movement I belong to, and the goal of defeating Susan Collins. Those were the goals when we launched this campaign, and they remain my goals today.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And that was Democratic Senate candidate for Maine, Graham Platner, issuing a direct camera denial of accusations of non-consensual sexual behavior. That video published just a short time ago, only minutes after Politico exclusively reported allegations from a woman who says Platner, quote, forced himself on her while she repeatedly told him to stop. This has major implications for the battleground race in Maine and for control of the Senate this November. And joining us now to discuss is Jessica Taylor, Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report. Jessica, welcome back to Bloomberg. Is the best path forward for Graham Platner, if he truly does want Susan Collins to lose her seat in the Senate, for him to withdraw from this race?
It absolutely is. He has the deadline to withdraw for Democrats to replace him is a week from today. I watched that video. That doesn't sound like a video that you release if you're thinking about staying and fighting this. This race was going to become about Graham Platner. It had already become about Graham Platner even before these latest, far more damaging allegations. And this was a race that was really complicating Democrats' path to a Senate majority. This should be their easiest pickup. It's the only state held by a Republican that Kamala Harris carried. Trump has never carried Maine, and Susan Collins, her favorability ratings have taken a plunge. This should be their number one pickup opportunity. And instead, it's North Carolina instead, and maybe even Ohio or Alaska ahead of that. So the best thing that could happen for national Democrats, these allegations, I think, Oppo, that I think the allegations were coming from inside the House, that some Democrat had these things and worried that Republicans were going to release them after the ballot deadline had already passed.
Wow. Can we just establish, Jessica, would it be possible, before we move on here with this particular scandal, would it be possible for Democrats to take the Senate without Maine?
I have a very hard time that they can take it without Maine. It's such a top pickup opportunity. That means that they would have to win 3 seats that Trump won by double digits. I think it's just a very, very difficult possibility.
So who are you looking at? You said Monday, right? Is it Janet Mills?
I don't think it's Janet Mills. There was just a very competitive governor's primary, and so there are several candidates that lost narrowly in that race that could look to run. Former state health director Nirav Shah has been mentioned. Former state Senate President Troy Jackson, who was endorsed by Platner, also endorsed by Bernie Sanders. He's from a very rural area. He sort of has the same sort of, white working class roots. You could also look at Dan Kleben, who owns the Maine Beer Company. He was already lined up to run before Chuck Schumer made very clear that his candidate was Janet Mills. So there's several candidates beyond just that race for Governor Shenna Bellows, who lost to Collins in 2014, but this is a very different environment and a very different state now. She's the Secretary of State. She also lost that race for governor. There's many candidates that Democrats have that would all be much stronger candidates than Graham Platner, given his multitude of baggage.
Well, as we're having this discussion, Senator Ruben Gallego, the Republican from Arizona, has just announced that he is rescinding his endorsement for Graham Platner. This seems to have some parallels as well with Eric Swalwell, who, of course, had to drop out of the California gubernatorial primary after allegations of sexual misconduct there as well. So we will wait to see what Graham Platner's future holds, and if he does make an announcement that he is pulling out of this race before the Monday deadline you mentioned, Jessica. But that is not the only Senate Democratic shakeup we have to discuss this evening, because over the weekend we also saw in Michigan one of 3 Democratic candidates in the primary for the Senate seat and Senate nomination there drop out in State Senator Mallory McMorrow, who had this to say in her video.
Today, I'm announcing that I am suspending my campaign for United States Senate. So here's what we do next. Every day through November 3rd, we win this Senate seat, and we send Mike Rogers back to Florida for good. Whoever wins this primary on August 4th will have my full support.
So with her out of the race, Jessica, who is likely to win the primary on August 4th?
It's a very close race right now. I think that Abdul Al-Sayed, the former Detroit Wayne County health director, who's the progressive favorite endorsed by Bernie Sanders, has the momentum in the race. And really, I think that McMorrow, there was worry that she was taking votes away from Haley Stevens, the congresswoman who is the clear favorite of national Democrats. They feel like she is the strongest general election candidate. So this becomes a very clear sort of more establishment centrist lane versus progressive outsider campaign. And we've seen, this is a real test because this isn't a primary happening in New York City or in Denver. This is a race in one of the most crucial swing states in the country. So can a more progressive candidate win a general election in a state like Michigan? That's something that national Democrats very much worry about. And national Republicans are not being coy about this. They would much rather run against El-Sayed than they would against Haley Stevens.
And so here we are again. How important then, Jessica, will it be for Chuck Schumer, for Haley Stevens to win that race?
It would be a major blow for Schumer if Stevens does not win. He has thrown his support behind her, both implicitly and pretty explicitly. She is, she has a lot of money coming in on her behalf, more than $30 million in advertising. And so if she can't win with that support, especially now that it's a one-on-one race with Abdul Al-Sayed, it would absolutely say something about the direction that the party is taking, that they did not feel like she was enough of a fighter fighting back against Trump. You had the United Auto Workers endorse El-Sayed, and even though Stevens was the head of the Obama bailout in the White House, so the auto bailout, so she's made that a big crux of her campaign. So this would be a major blow to Schumer if Stevens is not the nominee.
Well, obviously, we're watching these races very closely, given that they are ones that could go either way in 2026, Jessica, in this election cycle. The seat in Kentucky seems like it was less of a question. Andy Barr, of course, is the Republican nominee. And I just wonder if you think there is a risk that that potentially could get disrupted, knowing the man who currently holds the seat, Senator Mitch McConnell, has been hospitalized for more than 3 weeks. We don't know much about his condition. And of course, we all wish the senator and former Republican leader in the Senate well. But if he were not able to take his seat in the Senate back up, Jessica, what would happen in Kentucky?
Under current law, my reading of it is if the vacancy occurs before early August, then there would be a special election for this race. If not, then it would be just the regular general election. So there's some real question about that. But there was a law passed that it has to be a special election and not the governor appointing it, which there is, of course, a Democratic governor in Kentucky. They took that power away from him a few years ago when there was concern about McConnell's health. There's, of course, been ongoing concern about his health. So it looks like that there would probably be a special election unless, I think we're all just waiting to see about the former Senate Majority Leader's health there.
Jessica, thank you. It's great to have you back. Jessica Taylor with us live on Bloomberg. It was an Independence Day weekend full of Trump-related events, starting with a political speech at Mount Rushmore.
There is now a resurgence of the communist menace in our land, including from newcomers to our country who embrace ideas totally opposed to our way of life and our great success. These are not mere political disagreements like differences over taxes or regulations. Communism is a mortal threat to American liberty.
In that speech, the president took the July 4th occasion to hurl some aspersions against foreigners and those on the left, warning of the threat of communism without pointing to specific evidence. Now, those remarks were followed the next day by an unprecedented fireworks display on the National Mall, as you can see if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. It was delayed by several hours due to a massive storm that blew through town. The fireworks show aimed to break records with its firepower. Check the Guinness Book. The air in the District of Columbia remaining at unhealthy levels for more than 10 hours after the event wrapped. According to the Washington Post, it was pretty smoky around here. Now, there are renewed questions on the funding around the 250 events, with one key lawmaker in the House now calling the group that organized the festivities a, quote, shadow organization engaging in criminality, as congressional Democrats release what is a 55-page report on the matter. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Jared Huffman of California, who's ranking member on the House Natural Resources Committee. And Congressman, it's great to have you back with us today on Bloomberg TV and radio. Take us inside this investigation. There have been allegations, at least in media reporting, that funds were diverted from the America 250, a congressionally backed bipartisan effort, to the Freedom 250 Trump-backed group. What did you find?
It's first of all, thanks for having me. And you're describing a report that's the culmination of a year-long investigation that House Democrats undertook. And we've had nothing but resistance and obstruction in our efforts to understand what has been going on with this administration. We know that initially they tried to take over the bipartisan commission that Congress created 10 years ago to help lead our national celebration of our 250th. When that hostile takeover kind of blew up in their face, they decided on a plan B, which is to set up a shadow entity, this Freedom 250 LLC, and just try to sideline the bipartisan commission and make Freedom 250 the main national platform for all of these celebrations and all of the fundraising that went into those celebrations. So that's what our report lays out in great detail, how they did this, and some of the just frankly breathtaking things that they've done over the past year using this shell company.
Breathtaking things, Congressman, you may say, but are they illegal things? Do you have proof of criminality on the part of the president or the administration?
There's evidence of both things that are obviously a breach of the public trust, like hijacking this trusted nonprofit, the National Parks Foundation, and misleading its donors. But then there's also things that would appear to cross the line into criminality. For example, there were people who wanted to donate to America 250, the bipartisan commission, and after they made their pledge, they received wiring instructions for their donation to go into Freedom 250 LLC's bank account. If that is proven, which we think it very well may be, that's wire fraud. That's criminal wire fraud.
Wow. Okay. I'm guessing that with 55 pages, you might be able to go on, Congressman. What do you do with all this information? Do you wait until a day when Democrats are in charge in the House to pursue hearings?
Well, we're not waiting. We're going to shine a bright light starting now on this because, look, it's too late to keep them from tarnishing our nation's 250th celebration on July 4th, but it's not too late to stop them from using this corrupt playbook into the future. And if we don't call them out and stop them, that's exactly what's going to happen. Look, this Freedom 250 LLC, using our public taxpayer dollars, using our government's name, has been running around the world soliciting foreign donors, selling access to the president, setting up lots of the national park system's infrastructure, like the reservation systems for certain campgrounds and park facilities, and unwittingly having Americans that just want to participate in events or attend a national park feed their data into an internet operation that is part of Donald Trump's campaign. So they have been harvesting personal data, they've been misleading donors, and as our report explains, they may well have crossed the line into criminal fraud.
Does the committee chairman, Bruce Westerman, share your concerns, Congressman? Is this a bipartisan concern around fraud?
I wish it was bipartisan. We have tried at every step to get our Republican colleagues to join us, to write some letters with us, to use the power of the majority, which includes things like the ability to have hearings and have witnesses testify under oath, to issue subpoenas if you need to. And they have just been uninterested in any of it. They don't want to see it because, unfortunately, many of them are just afraid to ever confront Donald Trump.
Boy. Pretty remarkable as we read through elements of this report. The registration process, which I think you just referred to, was run through Campaign Nucleus, founded by Trump campaign operative Brad Parscale, which uses AI to score visitors and target persuadable voters. So presumably thousands of unwitting people handed over their personal information at this free FIFA World Cup fan zone on the mall. If this is true, Congressman, is that illegal?
It may well be. And honestly, as stunning as this 55-page report already is, there's reason to believe it's just the tip of the iceberg. We have people coming to us all the time with other examples of, how this recreation.gov, which is the platform for so many of these events and so many of these national park system facilities now, reservation system and more, may well be feeding into Freedom 250. A lot of it bears the Freedom 250 logo. So if you want to go to certain campgrounds right now this summer, you're going to get routed into something that appears to be linked to Freedom 250, which is the Trump shell company.
Wow.
Well, Congressman, obviously you've spent a great deal of time on this report. I'd like to ask you as well about other issues that have been occupying this Congress, this House in particular, which, of course, had to recess early before the July 4th holiday because no progress could be made on the floor. There's obviously a certain number of Republicans who want to see the Save America Act put into other must-pass bills like the NDAA in order to get things going again. Where are Democrats in this, Congressman? The NDAA is considered must-pass annual legislation. Typically, there ends up being bipartisan support for it. Would you be able to vote for this if anything akin to the Save America Act, any form of voter ID requirement is attached?
I think it will be toxic to most Democrats. Now, I have other problems with the NDAA. I don't typically vote for the NDAA, but you're right. It is usually a broadly bipartisan bill. And when you allow it to become part of this overtly hyper-partisan effort to sway the midterm elections for Republicans, I'd be surprised if any Democrat was willing to put up a yes vote if that's what this comes to.
Got to ask you quickly, Congressman, people might not realize you were a three-time All-American volleyball player and a member of the USA volleyball team in 1987. We've got a pretty interesting confluence of politics and sports here, it seems, with the president on the phone with the head of FIFA. Folarin Balogun is playing tonight, Congressman. Should he be?
It's just another example where Trump has made this about him in a way that, hangs like a dark cloud now over what should be a great moment for American soccer. So we may never know whether Donald Trump engaged in some corrupt act of leverage that resulted in this decision. I think it was a pretty controversial call by the officials and maybe should have been overturned on the merits. But Trump should have stayed far away from this. And this will have a ripple effect, not just here in the United States, but, if you wanted the rest of the world to hate our country, this is the kind of thing that you would do as the president of the United States, certainly the rest of Europe. Wow. So he's not doing America or American soccer any favors here.
But are you still rooting for Team USA tonight, Congressman?
Of course, yeah.
All right, we'll leave it on that note. Congressman Jared Huffman of California, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And still ahead, we'll have more on soccer politics and this controversy engulfing tonight's big match between the U.S. and Belgium after that probably now infamous phone call from President Trump to FIFA over that red card. We'll have reaction from our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We are just 2 hours away from the round of 16 match between Team USA and Belgium, where one of the U.S.'s biggest stars is set to be in the starting lineup, even after a controversial red card. Team USA striker Folarin Balogun was expected to be suspended for tonight's match, but after President Trump personally appealed to FIFA's president Gianni Infantino for a review of the red card play, that suspension was overturned.
Yes, I asked for a review by FIFA, I spoke to a man who's highly respected, and by the way, whose level of respect has gone up tenfold. And he was good before this started, but you know, he really pushed it in this country. I'm the one that got them to do it.
The unprecedented move has sparked pushback, including, no surprise, from Belgium. The Royal Belgian Football Association requested a reconsideration of Logan's eligibility in tonight's match, but FIFA denied that appeal. And joining us now for more on this is Bloomberg's Randall Williams. So, Randall, he'll be playing tonight, but does this effectively color whatever the outcome of this match is, even if the USA wins?
I mean, if you were searching for the FIFA 2026 Men's World Cup first controversy, here it is. Of course, if the U.S. continue to have success, then all everyone's going to say is, well, President Trump put his thumb on the scale, pressed FIFA to review Flo Balogun's suspension, and then, of course, FIFA made the decision that they did. They are going to allow him to play. They, went away with any Belgium protest, and we'll see him play tonight, and I expect him to start.
How unusual, how rare is this, Randall? Is there anyone other than Donald Trump who could pick up the phone and accomplish this outcome?
Absolutely not. I mean, you think President Trump is right in saying that he has had an avid interest in sports for many, many years. I was at the NBA Finals. He attended a game. I've been at several UFC fights where he attended a game. He attended the Super Bowl. But the difference is that when President Trump has said, I don't like the new kickoff, the NFL did not simply be like, well, President Trump doesn't like the new kickoff. Let's go back to the old one. FIFA effectively was already reviewing this. If you look at all the reports, whether it be Bloomberg's, Axios, Wall Street Journal, and so many more, what was happening was that the U.S. Soccer Federation had these attorneys who were saying, how can we appeal this? How can we appeal this? There was no appeal. There is no appealing system. So when President Trump makes a call, all of a sudden, they found a loophole in the system and Flo Balogun's going to play. So it's something for the U.S. fans and spectators to celebrate, but I'm not exactly sure that this is a celebrating time for the world of football.
Well, as you talk about exploiting a loophole here, Randall, has this particular loophole ever been exploited before? Is there other similar circumstances that have happened, if not in this World Cup and World Cups past?
Not exactly. I mean, not on the knockout stage. That's what is very big about this is that, if Belgium loses today, this isn't a group stage match. Cristiano Ronaldo, who was recently eliminated a couple hours ago, or maybe an hour ago, he received a red card. He was supposed to be suspended for a couple matches early on in the tournament. FIFA went away with that as well. But Ronaldo's out, and no one's going to remember that. If the U.S. wins today and makes it farther than they have ever made in a World Cup, then all anyone's going to say is, look, Flo Balogun played. He had an impact on the match, and that was because of President Trump. But this is the exact type of thing that President Trump likes. He loves the attention. And look, some people are going to credit him if the U.S. wins tonight with him being the reason why.
Huh. Randall, you've been great on this today. You should cover politics. Bloomberg's Randall Williams with the best beat in the building. Thank you so much. Let's play it to the panel. We've got a good one this evening. Democratic strategist Archie Siddiqui is with us, the founder and CEO of Bellwether Government Affairs, and Republican strategist Ashley Davis, partner at S3 Group. Would love to hear from both of you on this. I didn't think we'd be talking World Cup this evening, but you never know what the president's going to do. Archie, as an American who I'm guessing would love to see our team win, are you troubled by the way this played out or not?
Absolutely not, because one thing, I mean, all roads for Trump lead back to himself, right? Okay. He has an ability to really insert himself into the headlines. You think about this. We have in Balo, we have a superstar athlete who also is an American via birthright citizenship.
Fair point.
With Nigerian roots. So it's interesting. Yeah. You look at the Mamdani piece. He spent so much time attacking Mamdani. As soon as he won, who was in the Oval Office, and suddenly there was a love fest. So I think at the end of the day, I think the president is very good about getting himself into the news cycle. And think about it. We've been talking about Donald Trump all day.
Well, that's very true. Of course, not just for this reason. There's the Trump accounts as well. He's heading to NATO tonight, Ashley. But weigh in on this FIFA call in particular. Is this a president using his powers for good or for bad?
Well, first of all, I just want Randall's job, so I don't know sports as well as him.
Oh, we all do.
Really good,
we all do.
Yes. And I wanted to see what his shirt said. I couldn't see the whole thing. Look, my concern, yes, the president does stick his nose into everything. My concern or hope is that it doesn't take away, as what Randall was saying, take away if the fact that we do win just because, well, the president called. But if if the president called and FIFA overturned the ruling just because of that, then there's a problem with FIFA as well. So I would think that they're going to have to be looking into that. But listen, at the end of the day, it's great that what people are experiencing in America. We've heard that our citizens have been so nice to everybody in every state that we're playing. And that to me is what's exciting. And by the way, we talk about President Trump every day, all day, because he does something that we can all talk about.
Yeah. We can always count on that. Now, of course, he's taking the show on the road here. He's in the air right now. By the way, we're guessing he's watching this match on Air Force One on his way to the NATO summit, right? Oh, yeah. So he's going to be up all night before the first meeting. That aside, I can't imagine what it's going to be like for him to be walking in the room. By the way, Belgium, I checked, are paying about 2% when it comes to NATO, so he'll have multiple reasons to call them out. What's on the agenda for this NATO summit other than simply getting along, not creating an international incident if this one isn't already?
Well, I think it's a challenge when it comes to the president because we never know exactly what is going to come out.
Does he have an agenda?
From my perspective, I'm curious to hear what Ashley has to say, but from my perspective, I think he has been pretty consistent in terms of Europe stepping up. At the same time, but you know, we go to these things. Suddenly, he's picking a fight with Italy, right? So we just never quite know. So from my perspective, well, it's a wait and see proposition.
So would it be a good outcome for the other members of the alliance, Ashley, if it just doesn't go poorly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, I think that one of the big reasons he showed up is because of the help that Turkey has been giving us for Iran. I mean, a lot of the other countries have stepped up in some ways, but not as what he expected. But I think he'll continue to make sure that the NATO allies are paying their fare into NATO. And then I think that Ukraine will be on the table for a big part of the discussion, especially with the attacks from Russia last week. So, and then obviously Iran as well. So I think there's going to be lots of conversation around those three areas. However, I'm sure there's something up his sleeve because I'm actually surprised he's going. If it wasn't in Turkey, I wonder if he would not have been going.
Good question.
Need to pull you guys into electoral politics, as we were discussing with Jessica Taylor earlier. It feels like, he didn't use the word suspended, but it feels like Graham Platner is suspending his campaign. I think he said they were going to take some time to figure the way forward here. Kaylee's just pointing me to a headline on the terminal. Maine's Democratic Party leadership is calling on Platner to withdraw. This was the Democrats' big hope in flipping the seat held by Susan Collins, but they have a week to replace this candidate if he does. Do you believe Graham Platner is out in the next 24 hours?
That seems like the trajectory, and it's actually not a surprise in many ways. I will say on the sexual assault allegations, he does deserve a full and intensive investigation.
We should note there is an additional allegation this evening.
Right. Yeah. So I think, I mean, it shouldn't be enough that there are these press accounts, but at the same time, there have been a lot of troubling waters here across the board. We had Senate leaders early on trying to avert this type of situation with his candidacy. We had Schumer, we had Catherine Cortez Masto. Many Democrats were really trying to course correct early on. Yep. But obviously the voters always, you know, they determine who our nominees are. So it is good that we have this window on the Platner piece, but it's not a surprise.
Okay, so Ashley, as the Republican here, if you were Susan Collins, do you want Platner out of this race, or do you fear whatever Democrat it may be that could replace him?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, because it could be it could be a tougher candidate. I think she was getting some luck by having this drip of issues that were coming out about him, and I think that was the real problem. But I do agree 100% with Archie that we need to make sure that whatever he's being accused of, he's adamantly denying it, that everything, you know, was consensual, but that he make sure that is a fair investigation. But on the other side, I just think there's too much controversy. And if he doesn't get out now and only have a week, what did they do? But does the governor come back in? Because I don't know if she's that popular either. I mean, I would think that Susan would run against the governor. I don't know who else is up the Democrat Party's sleeve to maybe bring out in the next week, but it's probably the right thing to do for the Democrats if they get him out.
I'm just looking at the statement here, Joe, quickly from Maine's Democratic Party. It says party leadership stands with women and survivors, and that principle does not bend based on party affiliation. Wow. They go on to say, we are entrusted with deciding who represents our values and who carries our banner. That responsibility requires judgment, leadership, and a willing to act when circumstances demand it.
Speaking up is often costly. Remarkable, he did not actually directly address the Politico story. He did talk about troubling, serious, and false allegations against me. He also acknowledged the reality that perception is the story here. Even if he's not guilty of what's being accused, does he need to get out of the way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very telling that he canceled his schedule for much of the week. I think that speaks volumes. Also, just going back to who might replace him, the challenge is not talent, Democratic talent in Maine. I think there are some great folks who could emerge. Mm-hmm. But the larger issue is that Susan Collins is very formidable. She's a very formidable opponent. If we win Maine, I think there's a very high chance that Democrats will win, the majority back in the Senate. So I think that is more of a reflection of Susan Collins on the other side. But there are some candidates that could emerge that could be very competitive.
All right. Archie Siddiqui and Ashley Davis, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. We had a lot of news regarding Democratic Senate races in the last couple of days. In Maine and Michigan, where Mallory and McMorrow dropped out. And of course, for all of your midterms coverage, all of your coverage of Washington in general, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.